Hi, my name is Trinity, and welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through church history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History. In one of our last episodes, we talked about the Welsh revivals of the 18th century. The first of those revivals might have been the spark for many more, not only in Wales, but in all of Britain, as well as the American colonies. Stay with us today as we looked at what happened during the English revival here at Kids Talk Church History. Hi, I'm Trinity. I am 17 years old and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
I am Mina. I am 16 and I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan.
And I'm Christian. I am 15 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. Maybe it might be good before we start to explain exactly what a revival is, in case someone is listening to our podcast for the very first time.
Technically, revival comes from the verb revive, which means bring back to life. Christians speak of revival when they think the church in general has become dead or cold and needs to be revived.
But it's not something we can bring about, right? We can just say, I'm going to revive the church. It needs to be God's Spirit.
Yeah, and that's a very important thing to remember. God's Spirit used someone's faithful preaching of the gospel, but that person might have been preaching for years before a revival ever happened.
So talking about the English revival, who exactly was in it?
Well, I'm sure you've all heard of John and Charles Wesley and also George Whitefield. Those are the most famous names that came out of the revival.
Yeah, we mentioned Wesley in our episode about the Moravians because he learned a lot from them during an ocean crossing.
Yes, Wesley he heard someone reading Luther's commentary on the book of Romans and said his heart was strangely warmed.
Yeah, we don't really talk like that anymore. I guess we nowadays say I was very moved.
Yeah, after that, he started to preach with more conviction. After meeting George Whitefield, who was preaching in the open fields, he decided to do the same so he could reach more people who would not normally go to church.
For example, some miners who lived near the caves where they worked, sometimes miles from a church. Wesley was moved by the miners' reaction to the gospel.
Wesley also traveled on horseback to bring the gospel to people everywhere. Other preachers did the same thing at that time as well.
I've read that during his ministry, he traveled about 250,000 miles on horseback. That's like going around the equator 10 times.
Yes, and then we have George Whitefield, who became very popular in the American colonies.
Yes, we've mentioned him in our episode on Phyllis Wheatley.
They say Whitefield's voice was so powerful that he could be heard over a mile away, and that's how he could preach outdoors to tens of thousands of people.
I've read that Benjamin Franklin did an experiment to see how far Whitefield could carry his voice and how many people would fit in that space, and he estimated 30,000 people could hear him.
Yeah, I read about a famous actor who lived around the same time and said he would give 100 guineas to be able to say, "Oh," like Whitefield.
Yes, Whitefield was very dramatic. So John Wesley and George Whitefield were the most famous preachers of the English revival, but there were others, such as Charles Wesley, John's brother, that left us a lot of wonderful hymns. In our episode about Phyllis Wheatley, we mentioned an important noblewoman, Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntington, who supported a lot of preachers and missionaries during that time. And then there's an interesting preacher named Augustus Toplady. He's important because he really promoted the gospel as it was recovered during the Reformation, even when other preachers were mixing grace and works.
I think we have some hymns by Toplady in our hymnal too.
Yeah, in our hymnal, we have Rock of Ages.
Yes, and that's the most famous poem or famous hymns of his. When I read an article about Toplady, I was surprised to hear that he had a sharp argument with John Wesley about the gospel, an argument that lasted for years. Then I realized it was a very important subject, and Toplady was standing for the gospel as it was recovered during the Reformation and then confirmed in the Canons of Dort.
Yeah, in our podcast, we had an episode about the Canons of Dort, and those were the results of a meeting of Reformed pastors about grace and salvation.
Right. And Wesley was preaching or teaching that our salvation depends on the decision we make, and that we can lose it if we stop believing. That's a teaching that was condemned in the Canons of Dort. There's so much to say about Toplady, but we should really let our expert tell us more. He's Reverend Lee Gatiss, director of the Church Society and author of many books, including The True Profession of the Gospel, about the disagreement between Wesley and Whitefield and Toplady. He also edited 2 volumes of George Whitefield's sermons, so he definitely knows a lot about the subject. He's been with us before to tell us about John Owen. Reverend Gatiss, thank you so much for joining us again.
It's a joy and a delight to be with you again.
Of course. First of all, could you tell our listeners how the English revival started? Was it influenced by the Welsh revival, or did it start on its own?
That's a great question. Well, the English revival started in the 1700s when people like John Wesley and George Whitefield began preaching the gospel in a new and an exciting way. So not just in churches, but also, as you said, out in the fields and the streets. And they wanted everyone, rich or poor, whether they were in a church or not, to hear about Jesus. At the same time, something similar was happening in Wales. So I think rather than one revival copying the other, I think God was working in both places at once, like lighting lots of little fires that turn into a big blaze of faith all across Britain. And of course, George Whitefield crossed the Atlantic Ocean about 13 times to visit the American colonies and to preach there too. So he was part of the Great Awakening, as it's called, in America too. It took about 6 weeks to get to America by boat in those days. So it wasn't a small thing for him to be involved in that.
Now, we also talked a little bit about the disagreement between Wesley on one hand and Whitefield and Toplady on the other. Could you explain why the topic was so important to these men?
Yeah, it was all about grace. So Wesley believed, like the Arminian party at the Synod of Dort that you mentioned, Wesley thought that we choose to follow God with our own free will, while Whitefield and Toplady said it's God who chooses us first and gives us the desire to follow him. So they were in agreement with the Synod of Dort. And in some ways, it might sound like a small difference, but for them, it really affected how they preached, how they prayed, how they trusted God. Toplady especially wanted people to know that salvation is completely God's work from beginning to end, so that we can be sure of his love and not have to rely on ourselves. As part of this disagreement, though, Wesley said some quite mean things about Toplady. He said that he hated Whitefield and Toplady's teaching about how God chooses us. Yes, he hated it, and worse, some quite strong language. He even, Wesley, copied one of Toplady's books on the subject so that he could publish it himself. But in Wesley's version, he removed all of the Bible verses from it. And then he added bits of his own in order to make Toplady's theology sound really nasty. So I don't think that was a very nice thing to do. And Toplady was very upset about that, as you can imagine.
Yeah, so I also know that you wrote a book about this topic. So I'm pretty sure it must be very important to you. So why do you think it's really important for Christians as well today?
Yes, I think the disagreement they had is about important Bible truths. It's about who's in charge, who's in control. And Whitefield and Toplady remind us that God is in control. And that's really good news. God is the best person to be in charge, not us. If our relationship with God depends mostly on our own effort, we might always feel worried or not good enough. But if it depends on God's grace and his wise decisions, then I think we can feel safe and thankful. That changes the way that we live, not trying to earn God's love, but enjoying it and sharing it. So that's why I think it's really important.
Yeah, one of the, also on that topic, or a little bit different, but one of our only hymns is Rock of Ages in our very own hymnal. But he also wrote many more, and you quote some in your very own books. Do you have a favorite hymn by Toplady?
Well, you mentioned his hymn, Rock of Ages. That must be one of the most famous hymns ever written. Toplady wrote it in a storm when he found shelter in a gap between two rocks. And the hymn says that Jesus is like a rock that we can hide in. safe from sin and judgment. And I love the line in that song where it says, "Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling." So it's simple and it's powerful, just like the gospel. But although that's one of the most famous hymns, I do have a real favorite by Toplady, which is not so well known. It's a hymn called "Contempt of the World." And my favorite lines go like this: "Let the vain world applaud or frown, still may I heaven's path pursue. Still may I stand unshook and keep the centre of my hopes in view. I'm resolved to tread the sacred way that Jesus watered with his blood. I bend my fixed and cheerful course through that rough path my master trod." And I really love the theology in that hymn and the beautiful ways in which he expresses it. Being a Christian is not about being loved by everybody around us in the world, but following Jesus, who died on a cross. So we tread the sacred way that he watered with his blood. Life may be difficult if we're Christians, but we know that Jesus's way is the best way and it leads to heaven.
Yeah, of course. So moving away a little bit from Toplady, moving on to Whitefield. When you edited Whitefield's sermons, was there anything that really surprised you or was really interesting?
Yeah, I was really surprised by how emotional Whitefield is in his preaching. Sometimes we think of preachers in the 1700s, they must have been very serious and stiff sort of people, but Whitefield often cried when he was preaching because he really cared about the people and he wanted them to know Jesus. And people in the crowd often cried as well. His sermons weren't just smart, they were full of heart, you might say. He was quite a dramatic preacher. And I think, as you mentioned, one famous actor at the time said he'd give a load of money to be able to say the word "oh" the way that Whitefield did, because that was conjuring up emotions in the way that Whitefield did, so that people could respond. I was also quite surprised that Whitefield has quite a lot of good theology in his sermons. It's not just lots of stories or jokes that were attracting people to come and hear him. It was good, solid Bible teaching applied to people's hearts. And I really like that.
Of course. Yeah, that sounds very interesting. But looking at the overall English revival, what do you think Christians today can learn from the English revival?
Oh, lots of things, lots of things. We can learn that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Wesley and Whitefield and Toplady, in one way, they weren't trying to start a revival. They were just preaching the Bible, praying for people, and God's Spirit did the rest. So we should be faithful, speak the truth, and leave the results to God. Excuse me. It's also interesting that God uses people in different ways. So, yes, there were these famous celebrity preachers like Whitefield and Wesley who could preach to thousands of people all over the place. But there were also people like Toplady and others who just faithfully did their work in smaller places. So Augustus Toplady wasn't a traveling evangelist like Whitefield was. He was the minister, the pastor of just small villages in the countryside most of the time. But God blessed his work and people became Christians. So I think that's a good lesson for us to learn. God can work in the big ministries, but also in the small, faithful ones that people will hardly have ever heard about. We don't have to be big and famous to have a big impact for Jesus.
Yeah, that's great. I was just wondering, do you have a favorite story from the English revival?
Oh, there are so many, but that's a really good question. I think one of my favorites is sorry. I think one of my favorites is when Whitefield was preaching outdoors in Bristol in the west of England to many coal miners who had come to hear him. And when he was preaching, he said you could see little white trails down their cheeks where tears had washed away the coal dust that was on their faces. These were rough men, but the gospel melted their hearts. That's the power of God's word. On the other hand, sometimes when Whitefield was preaching, there were people who didn't like it. So he says that often people would throw rotten tomatoes at him. And once someone threw a piece of dead cat at him to try and stop him from preaching and put him off. And somebody else played a trumpet loudly nearby to try and drown him out. And I guess that just shows us that, like Jesus said, not everybody will like the gospel when we preach it. But we should keep on telling people about him anyway, even if somebody throws a dead cat at you.
Yes. So Wesley, Whitefield, and Toplady were all in the Church of England, which is also your denomination. Would you say that they all stayed faithful to it?
That's a great question. They all loved the Church of England. They wanted to help it stay true to the Bible. Wesley stayed inside the church, but some of his followers became Methodists, and that's the denomination which remembers him most, the Methodists. I think Wesley's teaching didn't really match the teaching of the Church of England on several subjects. So I wouldn't say that he was faithful to the church in that way, but he did what he thought was best, and he was very energetic in telling people about Jesus. Whitefield stayed in the church even when it wasn't easy and people tried to kick him out or persuade him to leave. And Toplady was the same. He stayed, and he often defended the Church of England's teaching in his books. Most of the great revival preachers in England at that time were faithful Anglicans who wanted to see the Church of England reformed and renewed in biblical faith. And I think that was a very good thing.
Yeah, I've read that the two main documents in the Church of England are the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles. Can you tell us a little more about them and how they help the church to stay faithful to the Reformation?
Of course, they're wonderful documents. I love them. The 39 Articles are like a guide to what the church believes, especially about Jesus, salvation, the Trinity, the Bible, and so on. The Book of Common Prayer is full of beautiful prayers and services to help people worship God together. It's kind of like the 39 Articles turned into prayers for use in the church. And both the Articles and the prayer book were written in the 1500s during the Reformation to keep the church faithful to God's word. And they still help us today to remember what's true and what's important. In fact, when I became a minister myself in the Church of England, I had to say that I believed in the teaching of the Articles and the prayer book, and that I would proclaim afresh in this generation the things that they say. They're very clear about who God is, how sinful we are, and how we can be saved and live lives that are pleasing to God in every way. I guess I wouldn't necessarily always use the same 16th century language that they do, but their teaching is still a really good summary of what the Bible says on key issues.
Yeah. So besides Toplady and Whitefield, do you have another favorite person from the English revival?
Yes, and you mentioned her already, Selina, the Countess of Huntingdon. She was a noble woman who used her money and her influence to support gospel preaching all over the country. She helped fund churches and schools, a seminary, and she even paid for some of Whitefield's work. And she would invite her noble friends to come along and hear Whitefield preaching to them. She had an evangelistic heart that wanted to see her friends won for Christ, and she wanted to invite them along, hear Whitefield preach, and be converted. So I love Selena. She's a great example of using your gifts for God's glory. We need more well-educated, strong women like her who love Jesus and his word and want to be involved in spreading the good news of Jesus and supporting gospel ministry. I wish we had thousands of women like the Countess of Huntingdon today.
Now that you're here for the second time on our podcast, we've already asked all of our typical questions that we ask all of our guests. But here's a new one. What do you do, or what do you like to do in your free time?
What do I do in my free time? Well, I love reading old books, obviously, of course, and I like science fiction, TV and books and films. And straight after this podcast, as soon as we're finished, I'm also going to a music concert with my daughter Lucy, who's 16 and who's listening just over here, because we really love all kinds of music too. We'll probably both be singing in the car all the way to the concert. So that's the kind of thing I like to do in my spare time.
That sounds awesome. I hope you have a great time at that concert with your daughter.
Thank you.
Reverend Gatiss, we're so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And listeners, be sure to check out our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, and let us know what you like or what you think of these episodes, and keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Mina and Christian, I'm Trinity. Thank you so much for listening to Kids Talk Church History.